What's going on, Patriots? Welcome back to Lippincott Talk. I believe this is the 5th episode. That's what my notes say, and I'm going to trust that. Welcome back. Welcome back. Today, there's always a lot to talk about. I had a tweet go viral a couple days ago now about Congress, and I feel like we should talk about that because why not? It matters, right? It matters what's going on in the country. The tweet basically that I put out there was just pointing out like Congress is a dead institution, completely unable to do its basic functions within the American regime. And I think you see that really strikingly in the fact that Republicans have the House, the Senate, and the presidency, and yet we're still having government shutdowns because Democratic senators won't allow funding to go through the filibuster in the Senate. This at least is the public affirmed reason. But just at a basic institutional level, the fact that a political party can win a decisive electoral majority and yet cannot implement its political will is a shocking indictment of the American regime as such. It's an indictment of where we are as a country. How is it that you can go and tell voters, hey, I'm going to go represent you, and then you can win. You can win all of the pieces necessary to pass legislation, to impose your vision, and change institutions and funding, and yet there are these procedural rules that get in the way of actually governing. And I think this points to some really deep problems in our constitutional order, and really with the way that we think about Congress as such. And I think we are not going to be able to avoid these questions for much longer. And I think I feel like the word that keeps coming back to me is disillusionment. I think so many Americans feel disillusioned with this political process. And the one bright spot in the last 10 years has been Trump. The one figure who's able to cut through the disintegrating amount of legitimacy in our system has been Trump himself. And, you know, and I think there's a lot of course, there's anger at Trump, perceived failures, there's anger over foreign policy, there's all this and that. But the core point is Trump, just if you step back and think unemotionally about what's going on and just see it for what it is, Trump represents the possibility of real change and hope for Americans. Even now, even when Americans disagree about the Iran war or additional involvement in the Middle East, Trump as a political phenomenon represents the possibility of a genuine consent of the governed, at least in some way, that voting for Trump means a change in American policy. There's a good account I like to follow. This guy's name is Prowler. And he's just been posting about how Donald Trump has been changing the way immigration policy in the United States is carried out. Trump has made real decisive changes in the way that visas are processed and the number of migrants who are allowed in securing the border, in enforcing immigration law. All of those things are happening. The problem, of course, is that there are institutional barriers to Trump's domestic agenda. And very, very difficult to overcome. The courts are opposed to him, and Congress refuses to do its job. And arguably, Trump plus Congress should be able to govern the country. They should be able to have an agenda and implement it in line with the will of the voters. That things that Trump talked about in the campaign, immigration, inflation, stopping woke insanity. Those policies were what Americans wanted. That was the overall explicit deal, and in the implicit cultural and social shift that Trump himself facilitated. Republicans, Americans, deserve to get what they voted for. They deserve to get the things that they were promised. So when we look at the country and we look at the problems, you know, some people will say they're single issue voters on immigration. And I want to see immigration reform, i.e. restriction. I mean, we need controls on immigration. But to me, immigration, foreign policy, law and order, even the aspects of the economy that are related to taxation and regulation and inflation, all of those things flow down from the issue of sovereignty. I am a single issue voter on sovereignty. Politically, what I want is the freedom to be able to have my own country. Right? I want sovereignty in my own life, and I don't have it now, and I'm denied it precisely because the institutions that should be protecting my interests are not doing so. They're failing. And the really obvious example is Congress. The filibuster, and I know this is outlandish, or it's not outlandish. It's not. It's a break from the consensus, which I've never been afraid to do. I'm going to break from the consensus here. The filibuster in the Senate is bad. Majorities should be able to pass their legislation. It is ridiculous to me that the Senate can engage in endless debate, which is not debate. Senators don't even need to be talking in order to conduct a filibuster at this point. You can have a rule that procedurally allows the minority, the electoral minority, from preventing the majority from exercising its will. It thwarts the will of the voters. It makes a mockery of our elections, of the Constitution itself. And by the way, it's not a constitutional procedure, right? I understand the Senate having a tradition of debate and each senator having the power to get up there. And I really do. Actually, I think members of the Senate, as long as they're standing and speaking, should be able to stand and speak for as long as they'd like, assuming they're unassisted. I'm all for that rule. You want to have a week's worth of debate on a bill, 2 weeks worth of debate on a bill, that's fine. I understand that. I think every senator should have the right to stand up in the senatorial body and speak their mind. I believe in that. That would be good for the country. That's not what the current filibuster rules are about. It's procedural, and it's designed to allow for a lot of backroom horse trading and intentional self-capitalization. A self-imposed weakness is the model for Congress. Our legislative model, the legislature model, isn't working. It isn't working. They're not passing legislation. They're not making laws. They're not doing the basic things that a legislature is supposed to do. And it really, I think, raises the question of how useful a standing legislature is in its own right. Really, the law isn't that hard to understand. I mean, how about just enforcing the most basic provisions in our regime? Laws against murder, theft. What a great place to start. There's a lot of theft going on in America today, just outright stealing, and a lot of it's facilitated by the government. And Republicans, conservatives, and Americans more broadly are angry with these institutions. They want systematic reform. They want many of these institutions abolished. They want their budgets cut. They want to keep more of their own money. They want a more responsible foreign policy. And Congress refuses to act. So the failure to pass the SAVE Act, to get control over elections, and the failure to even be able to pass a budget to account for the spending is damning. It is a damning indictment of where we are as a country. And there's a theme that a friend of mine has introduced to me, and I want to make it thematic for this show because it's good and it gets to the heart of the matter. The idea of stopping the deceit. Stop lying. Stop the deceit. Stop lying. Our system, our current arrangement of institutions thrives on an environment of lies. And it is the truth that will set us free. And walking the path of truth, I think, for me, is the central focus of all of my writing, of all of my work, of everything I do when it comes to the political realm. Walking in the light of the truth, walking the path of truth, and opposing lies. And that means a few things. First, it means doing the research the right way. It means thinking about the questions in a serious way. It means being able to do self-examination, to be humble enough to admit when I myself am wrong. And because the problem is when the empire of lies grows and grows and grows, the only thing that can cut through it is someone who's just willing to stand outside of the consensus and speak the truth. Is my work helping? Am I getting there? I think in part. I really do. I think there's been real progress made in the country. Trump winning the second term was a decisive blow for the sake of truth. Now, it's not perfect and it's not complete. We are all still works in progress. The country is a work in progress. And getting angry partway through the process, giving up, indulging despair, indulging in defeatism, indulging in fear and hysteria, paranoia, that's bad for yourself and for the country, and I'm going to argue against it right now. And it is not that I don't feel anger when I see things that are unjust. It doesn't mean I'm not disappointed when things don't go my way or when there are setbacks. But at the end of the day, the truth is what matters. Keeping the faith, just pressing forward, that is so important. It is such an important spiritual discipline, and it animates my work here. So when we talk about deceit and stopping the deceit and stopping the lying, one of the key lies inside of our institutions right now, and it's the one that the Senate and Congress more broadly tells about itself and about the country, is that we can't do anything, right? You have Senate GOP leadership get up there and say that they cannot, that they are bound by law, by rules that they themselves made and could unmake if they want to. That's a lie. It's just a lie. It's not true that Republicans are thwarted by Democrats right now. That is a choice that they have made and that they could unmake. And they should. I think a lot of conservatives will talk about the filibuster. Oh, if we get rid of it, then when Democrats win, they'll pass their agenda. And that's right. That's true. If Democrats win, then they'll be able to pass laws and make policy in their own name. And you know what? I say to them, I dare you to do it. I dare you to go in front of the American people and pitch your agenda. Tell them what you want to accomplish through the law. Don't use the back door of the administrative agencies. Don't use the NGO industrial complex. Don't use grants. Don't use the states. Don't use these entities that are lurking behind the scenes. Do it in the open. I dare you. I dare you. And here's the thing. The Democratic Party's actual literal policies that they want to implement are not popular. They are deeply controversial. When voters are given the choice of adopting or rejecting those policies, they have consistently opposed them. Democrats did not open the borders in this country by passing a law in the Senate and through the House. That's not how that happened. When Democrats attempted to ram through Obamacare, it was so unpopular that it gave them a near generational loss of electoral power. That's what happens when Democrats on the radical left are forced to pitch their policies to the American people and come out in the open and say what they want to do. So many of the worst problems in this country occur not because Americans want them, but because institutions have been set up to allow policy to be made without any consideration of the consent of the governed. And Donald Trump has represented consistently an opportunity for a different path. He has shown the way for real accountability. That's what the 2024 election represented. And that promise needs to be kept, especially in domestic matters. And I will be perfectly honest, I do not think the Iran war is a good idea. I have opposed it from the beginning. I have opposed it before it launched. I am on record about this. I have a whole view on foreign policy. What I will say, though, is what Trump has done domestically, what he wants to do domestically, is pointing the way towards sovereignty here at home. And even so much of the consideration about foreign policy, the criticism, the opposition, is flowing out of forces that Donald Trump himself has unlocked within the American regime and has channeled through himself, right? This moment shows us that we can do something different, and we should. And Congress needs to act. They need to pass the SAVE Act. They need to pass a budget. They need to cut funding to left-wing institutions. They need to put the DOGE cuts into law. They need to make these things permanent. They need to start paring away the left-wing institutions that threaten the peace and prosperity of the American people. Here's a great start. Congress could go in today and change the funding for the Department of Education and just get rid of it. Zero it out. Zero out student loans. Zero out funding for all of these grant programs. Zero out funding for immigrant, pro-immigrant, special subsidy for foreigners, for homosexuals, for women, for minorities, for everyone. No, we're going to have the rule of law, and that means we're not going to have special favors for oppressed classes or for special groups. We're going to have equality under the law, and that means that colleges and universities are not going to receive special taxpayer subsidies. They don't deserve them. Left-wing institutions that are damaging the core of this country, that pump out young people who have been infected with ideology, that use the power, state-mandated power to gatekeep access to a middle-class life in professional fields, that needs to go, and Republicans can do that right now. And if they did it, life would be better for everyone. You would have lower taxes, less spending, higher economic growth, fewer left-wing institutions that are able to have a corrosive effect on our social and cultural life. That's a win, and Republicans can do it right now. They could do it in Congress. They're not doing it because they're afraid, and they're hiding behind the skirts of procedure, of the rule book. And that doesn't cut it. That doesn't fly. That's not genuine Republican government. That isn't accountability. That's not what Americans voted for. Congress absolutely needs to fix itself. And if it's not going to fix itself, then we need to go to the root of the problem. And we need to just think from the ground up. And I'm willing to do that because I think you have to go to the root of things in order to really understand what's going on. Getting to the heart of the matter is always more important than monkeying with the secondary and tertiary effects. You have to go and justify yourself, and you need to do it over and over and over again. So much of the problem in modern day academia, in the media, in the government, is an unwillingness to ask the core questions in a serious way and sustain that argument through the chain of reasoning. Hey, you say that you can't do anything to pass Trump's agenda. Why? Give me that argument from the first premises, and I want you to defend that position. That's what every member of the Senate GOP should be answering for right now. Why do we allow the Hart-Celler Act to continue to be the standard for our immigration policy? That act has had profound effect on the American regime. It has changed the nation demographically, economically, politically, socially. We should be able to ask the question, have those changes been good? And I answer no. I answer no. There is a better way. There is a better way. And it starts with genuine accountability from our elected officials. Right? So that's the truth. That's the seat that we need to stop engaging in is we can't do anything to change things. We absolutely can. We absolutely can and we should. Well, that's my take there. That's the take on Congress and what we need to be doing right now domestically. I thought there would be, maybe I'll transition here to talking about foreign policy for a bit. I want to talk about some arguments I've heard for American involvement in Iran, and I want to address them here. I was talking to a very intelligent friend of mine who was discussing reasons for the United States to be involved in Iran and in the Middle East. Now, from my standpoint, we should take seriously what Donald Trump says the goals of the war are. And when he gets down to it, I think he wants revenge for the 1979 hostage crisis and for Iran's support of forces that have attacked Americans for the last 47 years or so. Trump is worried about their nuclear program once it dismantled. And Trump has also called Iran a state sponsor of terror, and he has called for the Iranian people to rise up against their government for the sake of preserving freedom. I would say the humanitarian impulse is definitely lower on the list for Trump, but I think the big ones are desire to support Israel. Should throw that in there as well. Support Israel, oppose Iran's support for militant groups throughout the Middle East, and get rid of their nuclear program. And at core, that rests on the idea the Iranian regime is irrational. If they possess a nuclear weapon, they'll hold the world hostage. They'll murder civilians. They'll murder Israelis. They'll destabilize the whole Middle East. And I have reasons for saying, look, I opposed those reasons, and I've articulated why, and shown I think there are real alternatives, and that's I think part of what it means to be honest as a scholar and as a citizen and as a commentator, and we'll set those aside for a moment. When I see people online talking about the war, what they often do is they'll start talking about other considerations, geopolitics, China, the world, and the sort of meme version of this is 4D chess. That really the conflict in Iran is about China and oil flow and about the strategic positioning of the American regime in the 21st century and ensuring that the Chinese, especially, and the Russians can't impose their will on the United States. And I had a good friend of mine who was making an argument along these lines. It was very serious. What he was saying, and if I could summarize his argument fairly, his point is China today has a virtual monopoly on critical resources for the rest of the world. Specifically rare earth elements, which are needed in the production of a lot of high-tech equipment. I was looking up, doing some research right now, and I was looking like something like seeing that the F-35 requires up to 900 pounds of rare earth elements per aircraft. It doesn't really matter. The actual numbers are unimportant. The point is that there are these complex elements and materials within all kinds of different machines and weapons, and they're crucial components, right? And China dominates the mining and refining of those elements. And there's a few reasons for that. And well, I'll finish out my friend's argument. One of the things he was saying is, okay, so China has this monopoly on rare earth elements. Okay, but the United States, through if it's able to control the Strait of Hormuz, and we have our own domestic energy supply, what happened? We have, we've destabilized Venezuela, and we now have more influence there. So what we're looking at now is the United States is going to be able to control like 70% of the world's oil supply. 70% of the world's oil supply. And we can use that politically in order to gain leverage over China. The way I would articulate my friend's argument would be something like this is global leverage theory. The United States uses its economic advantages to put pressure on China to get the Chinese to do what we want. And we need to counteract their own positioning vis-a-vis these really important materials that are useful for the construction of high technology. So that's an important, that's an interesting and important argument. I certainly don't want to live in a world where the Chinese have the ability to squeeze the United States in a way that drives our policy. Sovereignty means the ability to get out from underneath foreign powers trying to impose on us politically. Now, there's some good news, however, and it's this. We don't need to manage the world in order to free ourselves geopolitically from Chinese influence. The best thing that we can do is, for one, control our border and the immigration into the United States. That immigration is going to change politically our interest in foreign governments and in the Far East. So there's a very clear connection between Chinese migration to the United States and pushing for pro-Chinese policies within our government. As another part of that is that the more we're involved in these regions abroad, the more incentive there is for these foreign powers to be involved in the United States decision making. So politically, our sovereignty is affected very much by immigration policy and by the desire of foreigners to try and influence policy for their own benefit because we're everywhere and we're involved. So then it gets to the core geopolitical argument. Is it true that the United States needs to be able to control global oil flows in order to leverage against China because of China's position regarding rare earth elements? And I don't think that's true. I don't think it's true at all, actually. There are ways of reducing our existential dependence on China. In reality, I don't think we're existentially dependent on China right now. And if there were a real conflict with China, for one, it would really harm them. It would really harm their economy and their standard of living for their people. Much more so than in the United States. We have real advantages. We have the opportunity to trade in all kinds of markets all over the world. And what happened after COVID is you did see a lot of industries move out of China, and they were able to diversify their portfolios in order to prevent themselves from being beholden to the Chinese state, which can and has gone crazy at various points and done things that are really destructive of like industry and manufacturing and trade itself. So there are plenty of avenues. Like that's just an ordinary response of investors and entrepreneurs to the fact that the Chinese regime is not trustworthy in key ways. They're already doing that. But at the level of national defense, the United States right now can already be doing plenty to disconnect itself from reliance on Chinese supply chains. And let's use that example of rare earth elements. So I got into this and was just looking at some of the numbers. And I can even pull up, my research and what I've been working on here. So one of the most striking things is expense. How much does it cost, really? How much would it cost for the United States to build its own rare earth element processing and refining and mining in the United States? What was shocking to me in my research was that it is actually not that expensive at all, at least on paper. Like what I'm looking at in terms of expense compared to what we're spending on the war right now is shocking. So let me look at this. The largest non-Chinese, so when you think of rare earth elements, you have to mine them out of the earth and then you need to separate and refine them. So there's two big processes that are involved here. Actually getting access to the literal physical elements and then processing them in a way that's profitable for the market. The Chinese dominate refining, and I think they control like 90% of refining for rare earth elements. So here's the question. How much would it cost for the United States to build refining capacity here in the United States? Well, here are some of the numbers. In Western Australia, the Iluka Eneabba refinery, which the company that's building it, Fluor, says it is designed to process up to 23,000 tons per year of rare earth oxides. And the project costs, adjusted for inflation and for the US dollar, $1 billion to build that refining facility. Like, I'm pulling this directly from their website, and I quote, the $1 billion to $1.2 billion project in Australian dollars will produce high-value neodymium, dysprosium, praseodymium, and terbium. These separated rare earth oxides are critical to a range of technologies, blah, 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 blah. But there you go. You can see, they're saying the Eneabba plant is the highest grade rare earths operation globally. It currently consists of Iluka's unique stockpile of the rare earth bearing minerals, monazite and xenotime, as well as the company's phase 1 screening and phase 2 concentrating plant. And then they want to build a phase 3 refining capacity right there in Western Australia so that they won't be as reliant on China. But right there, the cost is like $1 billion to build this facility. I mean, that's what the investors who are working on this project are saying. Okay, so let's say they're wildly misestimating the real cost. That the real cost is 5 times as much money. It would cost, let's say, $5 billion to build that same kind of refining phase 1 through 3 processing facility in the United States. Okay, $5 billion represents 1/40th of the amount of money the Pentagon is asking for right now as a supplement just to fight the Iran war. So for like 3%, well, really like 2.5% of what we're spending right now on Iran is money we could spend right here in the United States to build that's assuming 5 times the cost of what it's taking to build that same facility in Australia. We could build right here for $1 billion, for $5 billion, for 1/40th of what we're spending on the Iran war itself. It just doesn't make sense. If the idea is the United States needs access to critical supply chains to build weapon systems for self-defense that are not beholden to China and the Chinese market, the way to do that is right there. Then build them here. Then build those refining capacity here. Create mines here. Survey for those minerals here. Find the deposits. I was checking, on government, it was talking about the geologic surveys to find these minerals. And it turns out a lot of stuff is outdated in the United States. The reason is environmental and labor regulations in the United States have not made it profitable for firms to build rare earth mineral and rare earth element processing facilities in the United States. And there's also geological problems in terms of accessing resources. The Chinese just have a much better access to deposits on their own territory than we know we have right now in the United States. But that could change with additional information and with additional surveying. It may be that there's they may not be economical in the free market right now, but if the government builds refining capacity as an insurance policy against Chinese misbehavior, that's actually a good use of government spending and money. And there's lots of ways to process how we should think about national defense. For instance, the Chinese give a lot of subsidies for rare earth element processing, and they have a different regulatory environment. So what we're doing right now and have done in the past is we're importing subsidized Chinese materials that are lower cost than they would be in the free market. And that allows the United States to purchase more quantities of weapon system per cost, because the Chinese taxpayer is subsidizing the American defense industrial complex. That's effectively what's happening right now. And the Chinese seem to be under the impression that if they can dominate production, then it'll give them leverage over the United States. The problem, of course, is there's room for venture capital and for the government itself to expand refining capacity here and to look for additional deposits of these critical materials in other locations and thereby get around Chinese supply chains. So then the Chinese will have rare earth element processing facilities that don't have economic viability in the current market, or they'll have to look for different clients. Since the beginning of the trade war with China after the implementation of Trump's tariffs, the Chinese have implemented increasing levels of export control over rare earth elements. They did some April 5th, and they did other policies that were implemented in October and December, I believe, especially regarding the export of rare earth elements for militarized application. But it's like, in reality, that's not a huge deal. Let me give a good example of why those kinds of export controls are unlikely to work. For one, the Chinese cannot verify with any degree of accuracy that the people purchasing these materials are going to use them for non-weaponized purposes. There's all kinds of ways to export something or import something and get around a lot of these regulations. I mean, there's outright smuggling, there's corruption, there are shell companies, there are all kinds of ways to get around those kinds of governmental controls. This happens all the time. The drug trade is a great example of how this works. These borders are often porous, and there's lots of ways to get around these state-sponsored controls. And that's good for the United States if our goal is to acquire as much of Chinese materials as possible for our own benefit in the near term to build weapon systems. This has been done before and not successfully by foreign governments. For instance, Britain had export controls on weaving technology and textiles technology in the early 19th century and late 18th century. And the United States got around this by, outright smuggling, industrial espionage, and then bribing technicians to flee the country furtively in order to come to the United States and help build manufacturing capacity here. So there's lots of ways to get around export controls and the Chinese government in the modern day. There's a long tradition of this in the American experience. And there's an argument for it in terms of national defense and what we need to do to take care of ourselves. So not only are there ways of getting around Chinese export controls based off of just immediate, you can use shell companies. This has been done before, by the way. The CIA used shell companies to purchase titanium in the 1960s and 70s to build the SR-71 Blackbird. And they did that because they needed to use, the only major supplies of titanium in the world were in the Soviet Union. So in order to build anti-Soviet weapon systems, the United States government purchased materials from the Soviets in order to build those systems, those intelligence platforms. I mean, where there's a will, there's a way. And so not only do we have short-term ways of just being clever and getting around these export controls, we also have the long-term ability to spend resources here to get around Chinese supply chains and preserve our own independence and sovereignty. And none of this has anything to do with needing to fight a war in the Middle East or control the Strait of Hormuz. We have the ability right now, and it's actually better for us because when we're devoted abroad, we're spending resources in Iran, in the Middle East to maintain control, which we don't have right now, of the Strait. We're meddling constantly in foreign politics, and there's grifters and parasites all over the place abroad who are trying to suck down our resources. And there's a much clearer, simpler solution right here at home where we can build if we need capacity for our existential self-defense, we can build it right here. And we can. We can stockpile weapons. We can build up capacity for future emergencies. Those are much better expenditures and far cheaper than foreign war abroad. Garrisoning the global network of American bases, I believe, it's actually detrimental to our safety. Whereas if the government were to sponsor the creation of vertically integrated production here to build weapon systems that it needs to preserve our safety and happiness, it could do so for far less cost and with very little expenditure in terms of and by the way, you're not at war, right? So you're not seeing the expenditure of lives abroad in these conflicts in foreign countries. So there's lots of reasons I'm skeptical of these geopolitical 4D chess arguments. Many of them completely fall flat when you start looking into the details. And many of these arguments often overlook the very real, there's much simpler, point A to point B solutions that are right there staring us in the face. So that's the overall argument I want to make right now. And again, the friend of mine who made this argument to me was very serious and in earnest and was right even. The United States should not be dependent on its self-defense on a foreign country. I absolutely believe that. And there are lots of ways to make that possible. There are lots of ways to stockpile the weapon systems we need, to stockpile the goods that we need, the materials we need in order to defend ourselves. We can build long-term capacity here to build the weapon systems we need to defend ourselves. All of this is very possible. We can engage in the surveying. I think I was looking at it in the survey cost. The United States has spent like $20 million, maybe $100 million in a different, $21 million for one kind of survey for geologic, looking for minerals, and $120 million on another kind of survey. If looking for these materials is so important, if they're so important for our national defense, then this should be done all over. This is somewhere we should really be spending money. And it's a pittance compared to the amount of waste, fraud, and abuse that is going on all over the federal government. Preservation of safety and happiness is the core purpose of government, national defense. And we can have a strong national defense right now without needing to look and go to war in the Middle East because the Israelis and Iranians have been engaged in a long-term Cold War, and also there's a bunch of geopolitical anger over what happened 50 years ago. That does not help us with the core problem of national defense when it comes to securing supply chains for our own preservation. There's much simpler and actually effective ways of going about that process. So that's the argument I'm making here. I'm throwing out these details and this initial research that I've done in order to provoke thought and, to push back against what I see as attempts to get too far afield from the core issue. Stay focused and tell the truth and know the facts. And it's like, there's still more to learn. I have a lot more to learn, and I'm continuing to work, and I want to encourage you to do the same. Seriousness and real patriotism requires that you use your mind. Never stop thinking. Never stop thinking. That's my motto for all of you. Well, I think that gets us to the end of today's show. That's what I had to say. And again, I just want to leave you with that same point. I want to leave you with that point. Just don't stop thinking. Don't stop using your mind. Continue to make those arguments. Continue to search out the truth. And continue to engage. I want to encourage all of you who've listened to this show to like and subscribe to my account on X, @JLippincott_. I also want to encourage you to subscribe to my Substack, Regime Critic. I produce a lot of longer form writing there. And you can also follow this show on YouTube @Lippincott Talk. So there's a lot of different ways to engage with this content. They're going to expand. I want to encourage you to engage with the arguments. Like, comment, share, subscribe. If you don't like what I have to say, you can DM me. You can leave me a message. You can send me articles, send me arguments. What I want to encourage you is to continue to use your mind, to continue to be devoted to the good of this country, and to continue to keep the faith. There's lots of reasons to do so. Anyway, thank you again. This has been Lippincott Talk. I'm your host, Josiah Lippincott.